May 7th, 1945. After a brutal month-long siege of its capital, and its founder and leader, well, committing suicide in his bunker, Nazi Germany has officially surrendered. The captors and liberators of the city were two rising Allied superpowers and their respected allies. Basically, the entire world fought against the Axis powers, and I believe that every side in every country needs to be accredited for that. However, I literally cannot list almost the entire world at the moment. So, I will, of course, name the two most notable allies uh, besides the United States and Russia, of course, were England and France. But, well, during the war, both of their empires basically suffered catastrophes. During the war, basically France, mainland France, got overrun by the Germans within 9 months um, at the beginning of the war. And then England barely managed to stay on and keep fighting during the war. Basically, because they had a huge global empire that could provide them with supplies and stuff. But of course, also because the United States as well gave them a lot of support and supplies. So, yeah, those two countries were barely still standing at the end of the war. Of course, they still did a lot of good things and they still put in a lot of effort for the entire war. I'm just saying, for the importance of our story, basically the biggest allied superpowers after the war that were still standing were the United States and the Soviet Union. So anyways, back to the story. When the United States and the Soviet Union and their respected allies captured Berlin and defeated Germany, and then at the end finally defeating Japan and the war ending, the United States and Russia were basically close allies for the most part. In fact, during the war, the United States also provided a huge amount of supplies and support to the Soviet Union to fight the Germans on the Eastern Front, and it's pretty debatable, but it is considered that without those large amounts of supplies given to Russia by the United States and England as well, the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front wouldn't have done that well. And well, during this and during the entire war effort, the United States and Russia basically had a close relationship and friendship, supposedly. At least that's what everyone wanted to believe at the time in order to fight and defeat the Germans. In fact, there were many propaganda posts and pictures basically showing the friendship between the Soviet Union and the United States, even though before the war both sides had disdain and even hatred for each other. But of course that did not matter, since like I said before, the entire war was to defeat the Germans. And that was done. And now Russia and the United States were friends and close allies, and they would never turn against each other. Well, that was the hope for the world, basically, but of course that could not happen. So, a couple of basically months after defeating the Germans, both sides were looking to each other again with hatred and disdain, and basically having a huge rivalry which would engulf the rest of the 20th century, and huge war and tension from basically the entire world. Yeah. And of course this would have dire outcomes for millions of people. And the results of all this are still seen to this very day. And, well, spoiler alert, but this war only ended like 30 years ago. So the results are still seen to this very day. In especially recently, of course, Afghanistan, which I'll talk about later on. And by the way, if I haven't made it clear and you haven't read the title of this video, I'm going to be talking about the start of the Cold War. I'm pretty sure almost all of you have some sort of common knowledge about the Cold War. At least I hope so. We learned a lot about it in history class. I'm pretty sure it's taught in every history class. But what's not talked about that much is the actual and real beginning of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union, and therefore the Cold War. But technically, for this video, the Soviet Union at the time was only referred to as the Bolsheviks and Bolshevik Russia. For some history buffs, I'm pretty sure you caught that hint, and I will be talking about the Russian Civil War. I'm pretty sure this video is going to be way much longer than I originally planned, but screw it. Again, everyone should have some common knowledge about the Russian Revolution, whether from history class, although I may doubt that again, actually, or maybe if you saw the movie Anastasia, you know, from Disney, which, by the way, spoiler alert, is not very historically accurate, unfortunately. But basically, to sum up, about 3 different political movements, revolutions, and brutal civil wars in the span of about 5 years within a couple of minutes. Fuck. On November 1st, 1894, a new emperor, or in Russian term, Tsar, was crowned Emperor of Russia, Nicholas II. And basically this guy had a very, very tragic reign. Literally on the guy's coronation, 1,280 something amount of people died due to a stampede because they were giving out pretzels and beer as a celebration for his coronation. And yeah, that actually happened. So, didn't start off that well. And a couple years later, the Russian Empire had a pretty big war with the rising Empire of Japan that lasted about a year, and was a gigantic defeat towards the Russian Empire. They literally lost 2 fleets in a span of like 6 months, and of course they lost like tens of thousands of troops. So yeah, his reign really did not start off that well. And then after that, Russia basically went through a pretty bad economic crisis that, well, basically led to a social economic crisis. And then Tsar Nicholas II decided to basically enter World War I. Or actually, I guess you could also say he kind of started World War I. But yeah, when the war started, Tsar Nicholas basically thought that, like, you know, it could be a quick and easy victory, and all the economic problems will end, and Russia will gain a bunch of victories, and his rule would be so much better. But unfortunately, that really did not plan out as he thought it would. Russia suffered heavy casualties on the Eastern Front, and actually massive amounts of lost territories up to 1917. In fact, Tsar Nicholas II appointed himself the leader of the Russian army in 1915, believing he could change the current of the war and bring morale and stuff like that. But like I said previously, up to 1917, it really did not end up that way at all. The Germans actually did pretty well on the Eastern Front, pushing the Russians heavily back, which, yeah, led to more problems with the social economic issues, leading to a communist revolution, which was actually surprisingly orchestrated by the commander of the German army. Fun fact. Yeah, the commander of the German army sent Vladimir Lenin who was in exile in Switzerland, back to Russia to start a revolution. And it worked out because basically by 1917 there was a huge uprising against Tsar Nicholas, which led to his abdication, and then led to a sort of democratic Republic of Russia, which did not last that much as it was also overthrown by the communists entirely. Keep in mind all that stuff happened in about a couple of months because the Bolsheviks or communists took over at about October 31st, 1917. So, yeah. After this, Bolshevik Russia pulled out of World War I, leaving the Germans free from the Eastern Front to point attention to the Western Front more during World War I. But after this, or during this, at the final stages of World War I, Russia went into a big civil war, which was mainly between the White Army of Russia, basically mostly monarchists or people that just were anti-communist and wanted a democratic society, stuff like that. Or also people that were extremely orthodox, and yeah, stuff like that, middle-class people. While the Bolsheviks or communists was made up of mostly former Serbs, which, no, it's not servant. Serbs were slaves, basically, in the Russian Empire. But that ended in about 1861. So a lot of the people were former Serbs that worked in factories or were actual servants and stuff like that. So yeah, they were mostly lower class people, less educated people and stuff like that. So basically, while all that was happening, a legion or army of Czechoslovaks were fighting in Russia against the Bolsheviks, and these guys were allied of the White Army and the United States, France, England, the Allied powers, or the Entente, as they were called, the opposite and enemies of the Central Powers. So the Americans, British, and French and their allies basically decided that they needed to help the Czechoslovaks. So they pretty much militarily intervened in Russia, specifically northern Russia and Siberia, where a large number of the Czechoslovaks were. I'm honestly going to make a future video on this legion because it's quite an interesting story. So yeah, in about what was it? I believe 1918 to about 1922. There were about 70,000 Czechoslovaks, 15,600 French, 30,000 Greek troops, 59,000 British troops, and most notably, according to our story, 11,000 American troops. And this is not mentioned at all, like in history, of the United States actually invading Russia, and especially during winter, as that freaking myth is so freaking spread around the internet and stuff. So yeah, that is quite interesting. In fact, about 400 American soldiers died during this intervention. Obviously, the Bolsheviks, communists won the Civil War, and they basically became the Soviet Union later on. But this had pretty large effects on the Bolsheviks and the future USSR, with the United States and Western allies invading Russia itself. Obviously that had some great influence to the future of World War II and the Cold War, but no one really acknowledges it, really, not even historians, which is interesting. So yeah, I just went on a huge side note explaining this, which isn't specifically the start of the Cold War, but it's pretty interesting, to be honest. But I'll shut up about this now. I spent about 15 minutes talking about it. So now it's time to actually get back into post World War II, 1945, 1947, the biggest and most important time, which basically led to tension and fighting between Russia and the United States all over again, and of course, the Cold War. Anyways, right, flash forward to 1945, the world is in shit and shambles. Specifically, and of course, for our story, importantly, Europe. After World War II, all of Europe, of course, was liberated from Germany. And, well, I guess the term liberated is used very loosely, especially for Eastern Europeans. Because, well, yeah, technically, Eastern Europe was not liberated at all from authoritarian rule. It just went to another authoritarian rule, actually. So, yes, everything in East Germany and east of Berlin was under the Iron Curtain of the Soviet Union, which was a clever nickname given to the Soviet Union by Winston Churchill in a famous speech in Missouri on March 5th, 1946, which was about the United States and the United Kingdom, or Great Britain, having to unite and fight against the rise of the Soviets and communism across the world, which obviously, when the Soviet Union heard about that, when all three of those countries were supposed to be allies, they were kind of pissed about that. Of course, it's also important to remember that between 1945 and 1947, before this speech was made, the Soviet Union was forced to give free and equal elections to each and every single one of the countries that they had liberated from the Germans. All these countries fought against the Germans or resisted the Germans, and therefore were allies. And even if they had not totally fought against and resisted the Germans, they still needed free and equal elections to see if they actually want to stay in communism under the Soviets or not. But of course, many of these elections were obviously rigged and or heavily influenced by brutal threats of the Soviets, especially at the moment where the Soviet Union was still ruled by Joseph Stalin, a man who killed about 20 million of his own people to establish the Soviet Union pre-World War II. So, yeah, it was a very scary time for most Eastern Europeans at the time. I believe about 1 million or 1.5 million Eastern Europeans actually died during Soviet occupation. So, yeah, it was a horrible time for Eastern Europeans. And that was basically what led to the United States, France, the United Kingdom deciding that they should try their best to limit and stop both the power of the Soviet Union and the expansion of communism altogether, which is what led to the creation of NATO and the United Nations. Both of these organizations were made as an alliance for the West to both help support and take care of other countries around the world, but also, of course, to stop the Soviet Union and to stop the spread of communism across the world. Alright, to be completely honest with you guys, I jumped around quite a lot in the Cold War timeline. I'm sorry about that. But I'll keep this last point short, and it's the most important point anyways. I'm specifically going to talk about when exactly the Cold War started, and it basically has to do with these two documents. In February of 1946, the American ambassador in Moscow made a telegram back to the U.S. Called the Long Telegram, made by George F. Kennan. And basically, what it was talking about is that the United States had to have a huge commitment to creating a strategy to limit the power of the Soviet Union and to prevent its spread across the world. That's basically what I've been saying a lot. I'm sorry, but right. Basically, George F. Kennan was asked by the State Department to make an analysis of why the Russians opposed the creation of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Uh, so Kennan basically made, like I said, the long telegram, which was a bunch of documents analyzing how the Soviet Union did not have a real belief that the Soviet Union would have a long-term peaceful coexistence with the West and basically the entire capitalist world. So he basically predicted that the Soviet Union would want to like expand and basically do the best it can to undermine and overthrow the West and the capitalist system altogether, because basically the Soviet Union wanted to rule the world just like everyone else, really. And because of this, most of the West believed that now the Soviet Union and communism would be just like Germany and fascism and the Axis were before, if not a bigger threat to the West. So he basically wrote an analysis talking about how they could make a new strategy called containment. This was the strategy that was adopted by the United States and the Western superpowers to basically prevent the Soviet Union from taking over the West and expanding communism in other continents where the NATO and the United Nations had very little power and influence, and were also devastated by World War II. So it was pretty much a bit of a race between the West and the Soviet Union to see who could influence the most countries across the world. This is kind of why many countries across the world are third world countries now. So yeah, that's kind of messed up. But anyways, then after this telegram, specifically, again, according to our timeline, Harry S. Truman, the president of the United States, and who was also the vice president of Roosevelt before he passed away, leaving Truman to lead the United States through World War II, and he was now facing a bigger challenge, facing the Soviet Union now. So basically, Truman passed this doctrine called the Truman Doctrine, which was an address made by Truman in front of Congress on March 12, 1947. And this basically played into a long telegram of how the United States had the moral right to prevent the spread of communism across the world and basically do anything in its power to prevent that. After this address, this policy of containment went straight away into the U.S. assisting in preventing communist revolts and civil wars in Greece and Turkey. And this is basically how it went on throughout the whole 20th century. The United States would find a way to either militarily intervene themselves or financially support either a military, a government, or a rebel group in money, arms, or again directly through military intervention of the United States or the United Nations themselves. Either way, this is officially considered the start of the Cold War, or the declaration of the Cold War. And it is, by the way, very much important to remember that the United States was not the aggressor or the person that started the war. And again, neither was the Soviet Union. History is not black and white when you actually do your research. But it's again important to know that both sides did horrible things throughout this Cold War, and both sides were responsible for the many crimes and horrible things that basically play out to this very day. As mentioned before, a lot of the reasons why many countries today are third world across the world is because of the United States and the Soviet Union. because of the West and communism. Again, I'll talk about this more specifically, but it's been about 25 minutes explaining all this. And I think, again, we finally have gotten to the point of understanding the Cold War. At least I hope so. I'm sorry if I confused you in any way, guys. I'm sorry if I, again, moved around the timeline so much and it got very confusing. But I promise I'll get better at this. For now, I think it went well. Again, I'll probably do this video again in the future, or get more into details later. But for now, again, this has been my first official video, and this is the start of the Cold War. And yeah, again, leave comments if you guys want, advice or anything really, or requests of future videos, of course. And yeah. Oh, like, comment, and subscribe, I guess, and all that crap. Don't worry, I don't really care about that stuff. But yeah, take care of yourself, guys, and be safe. See you next time in whatever future video I will make. I'm not entirely sure yet. So yeah, bye.